Hey, this is Dr. Kurt Wohler checking in here for Integrative Medicine Academy. This is the Great Plains Laboratory complimentary sponsored webinar, trying to figure out the description. So we're going to talk in this webinar about 5 key tests that are really important for environmental toxicity assessment. So I've done a lot of webinars now over the years for Great Plains through this service, talked about, autism-related problems and neurological issues and digestive system problems. So this isn't particularly linked to one particular type of health concern. I'm going to talk about a number of things. So if you're a parent of an autistic child, this information is relevant to you. If you're an individual yourself who's looking to sort of assess yourself for particular toxins, this information will be very important. If you're a practitioner dealing with a wide variety of patients with health problems, again, I hope that you'll come away from this lecture with some tips and some useful suggestions. So, if you've not heard me before, I'm Dr. Kurt Wohler. I've been an integrative and functional medicine physician for over 20 years. I do a lot of clinical education for Great Plains Laboratory. I actually teach their one-day intensive seminar on the use of the organic acid test in practice. I speak throughout the United States as well as internationally. I'm also the co-founder of Integrative Medicine Academy. This is an academy that we have, an online academy that is all about courses for integrative medicine. So autism mastery, toxicity mastery, SIBO mastery. I'll talk more about that a little bit later. And then I've worked with the autism community now for over 20 years, and also work with patients with gastrointestinal and neurological disorders. If you are interested in getting a copy of this free ebook, you can text the word toxicity to 66866, and I'll talk about a course we have coming up here shortly on toxicity related issues. So here's how it's going to go. We're going to talk about just some general things with regards to toxic chemical problems, and then for me, the 5 key tests are the organic acids test, the GPL tox profile, which is also called the non-metal chemical profile test from Great Plains, the glyphosate and microtox profiles, and then heavy metal assessment. So first off, toxic chemical problems. There's clearly a problem in our world today, not only here in the United States, but around the world, of people being exposed to a wide variety of different chemical toxins. And the estimates is that there's approximately 80,000 different compounds that are released into the air and water in the United States per year. So there's hundreds of thousands of tons of different types of chemicals that can be used from farming to industry, etc. And less than 10% of these have actually had any safety studies. So everything from phthalates to pesticides to polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, these things for some people can have significant health consequences, from cardiovascular problems to immune system issues, neurological disorders, and even cancer. And then birth defects. I mean, this is something that has been strongly linked to many different types of environmental chemicals. Now, women who are exposed to chemicals do have an increased risk for children with birth defects, or just having babies that are premature, or many times, women who miscarry frequently can have chemical exposure issues. We know that here in the US, and it's also the same around other places in the world, that there's a large amount of autistic kids. The rates continue to increase, and depending on where you are in the United States, the rates can shift anywhere between 1 to 38 kids to 1 in 64, somewhere around there. And those statistics are fairly comparable to other countries as well. And the higher rate of certain chemical exposures in women who are pregnant will increase the risk of having a child with autism. So there's many different sources, from the common things like insecticides and herbicides, to things used in our carpet, to paint, to things that are used as plasticizers or cosmetics and shampoo and perfumes. I mean, so there's a wide variety of chemicals, and they don't all carry the same level of toxicity. But for many people, it's an accumulative problem. So it's not just one chemical, it could be 15 different chemicals that have a somewhat of a synergistic effect, perhaps, in a susceptible individual. Another form of chemical exposure, although it doesn't really get listed sort of in the same category, is mold exposure, whether it's coming from within the home, or food. You know, food source mold is also a common source of some mold exposure. Aspergillus mold is the most common mold that we're all exposed to. Now, for some people, that just triggers allergic reactions. Could be a cough, could be sneezing, could be wheezing from a respiratory standpoint, or rashes. In other individuals, the mold will actually trigger what's called mycotoxin toxicity, which I'll talk about here shortly. So in my experience, and one of the reasons I teach the one-day intensive seminar on the use of the organic acids test, is that this is a cornerstone test. Personally, I do not feel that it's really worth starting testing assessment for these other chemicals and mold toxins if you've not done an organic acids test. Because to me, the organic acids test is the hub of the wheel. It's the foundation, it's the cornerstone of assessment. And there's a lot to learn with this test. There's, you know, over 74 markers, I think 75 now, markers on this particular test that have tremendous clinical significance for people of all ages. So we've got markers for yeast and fungus, looking at invasive candida and mold exposure. We've got bacterial markers linked to Clostridia bacteria toxins that can not only have adverse effects in the digestive system, but also the brain and nervous system. We've got markers indicating mitochondrial dysfunction, which can compromise every organ system in the body. Indicators of detoxification status, looking at glutathione deficiencies. Glutathione is a very important chemical that's often deficient in people who have chemical exposure. If you've ever done an organic acid test, you know there's a number of markers on page 1 that are linked to yeast and fungus exposure. 2, 4, and 5 on the organic acid test have a strong link to Aspergillus mold exposure, the most common mold that all of us are exposed to. And it's thought that it's most likely showing, when these markers are high on the OAT test, that there's probably Aspergillus mold growing within the digestive system. That's at least thought to be occurring. Marker 9 on the organic acid test, tricarboxylic, is actually linked to a fusarium mold, another common mold environmentally many times found in homes that have had water damage. And oftentimes when people are exposed to mold, we'll sometimes see elevations of bacterial markers too. So the bottom of page 1 of the organic acid test has markers of Clostridia bacteria, the most common one being HPHPA, linked to different types of Clostridia bacteria that have adverse effects on the brain and nervous system. And all of these things can coalesce to create mitochondrial problems. Page 2 of the organic acid test has a number of markers that indicate mitochondrial damage, or what's called mitochondrial dysfunction. Succinic, for example, is very commonly elevated in the presence of chemical and heavy metal exposure. So it's one of the things that I teach, that if you see that marker high, although it may not be absolutely definitive in all cases, it's certainly highly correlated with chemical exposure, which means that it's worth it, you know, to be doing additional testing to look for these other environmental factors. Now, mitochondria are critically important because mitochondria play a role in cellular metabolism. They play a huge role in liver function, brain and nervous system function, immune function as well. And these are the organelles, these little systems within our cells that produce the energy currency chemical ATP that our body needs to run. And in fact, if we don't have enough ATP, our detoxification capacity is going to be compromised. And if we don't have enough mitochondrial activity, then metabolic metabolism throughout the body is going to be compromised. And one of the things that gets compromised by mitochondrial dysfunction is glutathione production. We actually need ATP to produce glutathione. And as we turn that around, we actually need adequate amounts of glutathione to actually protect our mitochondria. The citric acid cycle is one component of mitochondrial activity. Succinate, let me get a different color pen here. Succinate, also called succinic acid, is a key component of citric acid cycle metabolism because it's linked to what's called the electron transport chain, part of our mitochondria that produces the bulk of ATP. So something that damages the citric acid cycle could compromise our succinic acid, which then compromises our electron transport chain, which then compromises ATP production. And then that compromises just cellular metabolism and all of the beneficial factors that happen through, or should happen, through energy production throughout the body. So there's a lot of things that can impact on mitochondria, from nutritional deficiencies to mold toxins to metals to chemicals, and then gut-derived toxins from fungus and Clostridia. An organic acid test helps us to identify that. Glutathione deficiencies. Glutathione deficiencies are common from various chemical exposures. We have to have robust levels of glutathione in order to protect our cells, as well as be able to detoxify substances out of our body. The organic acid test has a number of markers that are linked to glutathione status, particularly pyroglutamic, for example. If the pyroglutamic marker is elevated, it will indicate a deficiency of glutathione. Succinic, again, has a strong link to chemical exposure. Well, it's not uncommon in people who have long-standing chemical exposure to have glutathione deficiencies. So the organic acid test is indicating that that's a problem. It's not telling us what chemicals are causing it or if there are even chemicals involved. Maybe it's mold. So this is where we have to do additional testing to put the pieces together. The next phase of assessment would be the environmental chemical test called the GPL tox profile. This is also called the toxic non-chemical profile. It looks at a wide variety of chemical toxins. Again, from phthalates to benzene to xylene to herbicides, pesticides, etc. Very comprehensive test. You'll often see, if you do a GPL tox test, that this particular chemical called 2-hydroxyisobutyric acid is often high. It's also called MTBE. It's actually found from gasoline exposure. And it's a neurotoxin. It can be toxic to the nervous system, toxic to the central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, cardiovascular system, carcinogenic in animal studies. As you can see, in this particular person, their level is extremely high. So unfortunately, it's a very common chemical. Fortunately, if you have good water source and good detoxification status within your body, you can get rid of many of these chemicals pretty effectively. Another chemical that is commonly elevated on the GPL tox is something called 1,3-butadiene. I often see it elevated in kids, particularly kids who play a lot of sports, because many of the synthetic sports fields here in the US anymore are these synthetic grass. They have this little rubber beads that make up the turf surface. It can also be linked to cardiovascular illness and compromise nervous system function too. Watch out for perchlorate. if you or anybody that you're associated with is suffering with low thyroid function, it may be, I can't say caused in all cases, but a contributing factor could be perchlorate exposure. Perchlorate is fairly common throughout the United States in municipal water supplies. It comes from bleach and fertilizers. Fireworks are a huge source of perchlorate. And what it does is it essentially blocks the thyroid's ability to utilize iodine. So it can't make thyroid hormone effectively. Organophosphates, dimethylphosphate, diethylphosphate are serious problems. These are strong neurological toxins. Children who are exposed to organophosphates often have learning difficulties. They have poor reflexes. They have a higher risk of developing attention problems, behavioral issues. Children with autism who are exposed to these particular types of pesticides like chloropyrifos, which is a organophosphate, many times will have poor behavior, poor attention, poor focusing, poor language development. 2,4-dichlorophenoxic acetic acid, or what's called 2,4-D. This was a chemical that was used in the Vietnam War as part of their Agent Orange campaign to they spray this around to create some deforestation to be able to see the enemy better. It's now used as a weed killer for lawns. It is a major nervous system toxin for many people. Peripheral neuropathy, headaches, dizziness, seizures, brain damage, and it's even now being linked to amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, also called ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease. It is now also being combined with glyphosate. Okay, so it's a compound that here in the United States is fairly common to be exposed to. Glyphosate is one of these compounds that has been around a long time, and there's a lot of places in the world that are now heavily exposed to glyphosate. It's used on genetically modified food, so corn, cotton, soy, for example. And one of the things about glyphosate is that it actually inhibits the way certain plants utilize nutrients for growth. It's also used on plants to kill the remaining green parts, so it's used as what's called a desiccant. So there's a lot of different types of plants that can be exposed to glyphosate. And the World Health Organization in 2015 really put glyphosate out there as a probable carcinogen in animal studies. And there has been some recent, evidence now from lawsuits where things have come out where it's, glyphosate is being linked to different types of cancers, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, for example. And the use of glyphosate here in the United States has gone up significantly since the mid-90s. This particular slide ends at 2012, but you can look at the different crops from corn to soy and their exposure rates to glyphosate. In fact, if you look at the mid-90s as far as agricultural use of glyphosate, certainly Central California was fairly high and the Midwest was fairly high. But then fast forward to 2012, the levels in those areas are so much more concentrated. I mean, let me go back on the slide. Look at the Midwest, okay, just from, this section right here in the middle part of the country. If you focus on what happens from then till now, I mean, it's unbelievable. And that's as of 2012. And so what's happening is that glyphosate blocks this particular enzyme, which ultimately leads to an inability of the plant from utilizing these amino acids, tyrosine, tryptophan, and phenylalanine. The problem is that some of the good bacteria that exist in the digestive system also utilize these amino acids. And a lot of studies are now showing that in an individual who's exposed to glyphosate long-term, there can be a disruption in the microbiome, this ecosystem of the gut, where we're getting a ratio shift between beneficial to harmful bacteria, to where all of a sudden we're starting to get more pathogenic bacteria like salmonella and clostridia over the good guys. Okay, so the good bacteria levels are starting to diminish, and there is a problem in our microbiome. And one of the things that happens with Clostridia bacteria is these Clostridia bacteria are incredibly opportunistic. We know a lot about Clostridia difficile in that it produces toxins that have a damaging effect in the lining of the digestive system. Some people, it's just associated with diarrhea, like Clostridia difficile associated diarrhea. Others, it can lead to extreme inflammatory bowel problems in a condition called pseudomembranous colitis. But there are other toxins that Clostridia produces, and this is something that the organic acids test that Great Plains provides can allow us to assess. 4-creosol, for example, which is produced from certain strains of C. difficile, will inhibit this particular enzyme called dopamine beta hydroxylase. And dopamine beta hydroxylase is responsible for converting dopamine to norepinephrine, so that eventually we produce epinephrine to have enough energy to run our body. Well, if we block dopamine beta hydroxylase, that reaction can be compromised. And we start to see an increase of dopamine. Too much dopamine is toxic within the nervous system. Other Clostridia bacteria produce a compound called HPHPA. HPHPA as well inhibits dopamine beta hydroxylase, leading to an increase of dopamine. And then the toxic reactions from excess dopamine within the nervous system, because one of the things that happens with too much dopamine is it can lead to oxidative stress, nerve cell damage, can actually start to break down dopamine producing neurons in the brain that leave people susceptible to things like Parkinson's disease. Another area of assessment that needs to be considered is heavy metal exposure, from arsenic to lead to cadmium to mercury. And there's many tragic, scenarios of environmental mercury poisoning. This is an image here of individual dying of mercury exposure in the Minamata Bay area of Japan, where this particular fishing community was poisoned by water being dumped into the waterways from a corrupt, as you'll call it, factory that was, polluting the environment. And many people became extremely ill, and many people died because of this exposure. We know that autism rates around the United States increase when there is a higher amount of mercury present. So the incidence of autism, generally almost all the data you look at, increases with the higher rates of mercury exposure. Lead has been known about for a long time. Very strong correlation to lead with regards to attention deficit and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. In fact, anymore, all levels of lead exposure are considered to be harmful. And a hair analysis can be an extremely effective way of at least assessing for certain metals like lead. And you would expect the higher the lead level in the child, the potential, it have cases, but the potential for attention deficit behavior is increased, as well as a decrease in academic performance. So to me, on every child, teenager, or adult who's dealing with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or academic problems, etc. Aluminum is a major problem. Many vaccines today contain aluminum. It's known to help trigger immune reactivity. This has not only been a problem in adults, but it's also been a problem in autism, because one of the reasons aluminum is actually in vaccines is that it's called an adjuvant. It helps to stimulate immune activity. And it has been associated with different types of pro-inflammatory chemicals, which can have adverse effects on the brain and nervous system. Aluminum environmentally over time acquired has also been associated, and thought to have a strong link to Alzheimer's disease. So there's the aluminum story with Alzheimer's is complicated, but what really has been looked at is that, and again, it's not going to it doesn't mean it has to happen in everybody, but accumulation of aluminum over time has a triggering event of inflammation and can lead to neuropathological markers that correlate very strongly with Alzheimer's disease. Because when you start triggering inflammation in the brain, you start to affect different structures and areas in the brain that are linked to memory formation, etc. So aluminum toxicity, again, has a very strong correlation to these types of problems. Excuse me. Apologize for that. I was at a home office today. I didn't realize our family cat was in the room. Okay. Other metals, mercury being strongly linked to certain forms of cardiovascular disease. Antimony, arsenic are also sources of heavy metals that in select individuals can be problematic. So this is a quick comparison of 3 different tests, from the same person when it comes to heavy metal assessment. One of the things that the stories behind metal exposure is that there isn't one specific test that gives us absolute levels of heavy metals in the body. And this has always been the challenge, is that there's not that one test that will do that. You can do a blood test, and unless there's been recent exposure, the blood levels may not be that high, which is exactly what's happening here. Many times doing a urine analysis for metals, if you've not used some type of chelator, will show low levels. Again, particularly if there's not ongoing exposure or high level exposure at any one time, but exposure could have been in the past, the levels may not be that high. But a hair analysis is pretty reflective, and because it gives an indication of past exposure that has been stored up in the body over time. But one take-home message here is that whether it's blood, whether it's urine, whether it's hair, it's only indicating exposure. It doesn't tell us exactly how much is in the body or exactly where it is in the body. All of us have had exposure to metals. I mean, we all live on planet Earth, and there's just going to be a certain reality that we're going to be exposed to some of these things. What separates one person from the next is their ability to handle that exposure, manage it, deal with any potential consequences, and detoxify it. And the more exposures you have, the greater the risk and potential problems that could occur. So as an entry-level test, it's always been my feeling that a hair analysis is an excellent place to start. It gives an indication of exposure. It opens the door to discussion of perhaps, is it worth doing further testing, or even perhaps considering heavy metal detoxification. If you rely solely on urine testing, even just as a baseline test, you probably won't pick up on a lot of heavy metals. If you solely rely on blood testing, again, you may not be able to pick up on the presence of heavy metals unless there's been some acute exposure. So I really think the best entry-level test for exposure, for assessment, is the hair analysis. Microtoxins are now another test that we can look at, another thing that we should consider with regards to environmental exposure. And this could even be happening in somebody who's not manifesting with allergies, because most people who are exposed to Aspergillus mold, who are having allergic reactions, will, again, as I mentioned before, they might have respiratory problems. They could have nasal congestion. They could have respiratory issues, wheezing, coughing, for example. So now we're getting some kind of an allergic sensitivity problem, okay? Allergic reactions, lung infections, etc. But that's not happening in everybody. And Aspergillus, we know, can trigger the production of mycotoxins. And these mycotoxins are chemicals that are produced by molds. They often go undetected by the immune system. They can hide out of the body for years. They can cause all kinds of damage within our DNA at our cellular level. They can damage the mitochondria. Some of them are carcinogenic. Many of them are liver toxic and kidney toxic. And again, they can be stored in the body for years, even though your exposure to mold is long gone. Everything from headaches to nausea to vomiting to disruption of sleep to immune problems to cancer in some cases, neurological conditions have been associated with mycotoxins. The severe mycotoxins produced from molds like Stachybotrys, which is the black-green mold, found in water damaged buildings where there's a constant source of humidity and moisture, can be extremely toxic because these mycotoxins called trichothecenes, which get produced from some of these molds, are immune suppressive. They cause tissue injury, and they can even lead to themselves mitochondrial damage. Aflatoxin, a toxin produced by Aspergillus mold. It's carcinogenic. It can damage the liver. The only way to know if aflatoxin is present is you have to do the mycotox profile. You can't assume that these toxins are present just because you did an organic acid test. You have to put the pieces together. So the organic acid test provides insight into metabolic imbalances that could be caused by the exposure to other things, the exposure to chemicals. Well, you don't know what chemicals you've been exposed to or your family's been exposed to. You have to test for it. And so doing the GPL tox test allows us to identify what the source is. The organic acids test, again, as I mentioned, is the hub of the wheel. It provides data on mitochondrial imbalances and other metabolic imbalances, but we still need to do further testing to really put the puzzle together. Glyphosate, we know, is a toxin that can increase the potential for Clostridia bacteria, for example. Great Plains actually carries the Envirotox panel, which is a combination of where the oat, the GPL tox, and the glyphosate are combined as a package. They're separate tests, but they're packaged together in this Envirotox panel. You can contact Great Plains for more information. So from a comprehensive functional medicine assessment standpoint, the labs from Great Plains Laboratory that I recommend doing, you always got to start with the organic acids test. If there is suspicion of chemical toxin, the GPL tox profile is a must. I would also recommend doing the glyphosate profile. Do these things together, okay? Do a glyphosate and the glyphosate and the GPL tox together. Mycotox profile, you don't want to overlook that. And then a heavy metal, as I mentioned, this could really be a broader discussion, almost an entire lecture in itself, because there's so many different types of metal tests. But I always start with a hair analysis, the hair metals test, because it gives me an assessment of metal exposure. It also gives me an idea of mineral imbalances too. So ideally, all 5 of these things would be a fantastic place to start for comprehensive assessment. Now, there's a website, Lab Test Plus. Lab Test Plus is a self-ordering website where you have access to many of these labs from Great Plains Laboratory and some others. And all 5 of these lab tests are available through Lab Test Plus. And when you order through Lab Test Plus, there's a written review that comes with each lab test, and they order call to action step suggestions based on some of the markers. You can go to labtestplus.com for a more complete list of labs available. As I mentioned up front, I'm the co-founder of Integrative Medicine Academy. Integrative Medicine Academy is an online training website for healthcare practitioners interested in learning more specifics about integrative medicine for their practice. And we have a number of different courses. The Autism Mastery course is one of the most, I believe, the most comprehensive biomedical autism course available. We have a SIBO course, hormonal courses as well. And we have a specific course called Toxicity, or what's called Toxicity Mastery course. And the Toxicity Mastery course is a very in-depth course that goes through all of the testing that we just talked about, but in a much greater detail. We go through the organic acid test and layer in information about chemical toxins, mold toxins, mitochondrial dysfunction. We go through the GPL tox profile. We go through the different heavy metal tests. We have 2 separate modules just on mold toxicity and mycotoxin assessment and treatment. And then a variety of different treatments, from sauna therapy to ion cleanse to chelation therapy to supplements, protocols, etc. So for more information about the Toxicity Mastery course, you can go to toxicitymasterycourse.com or email to toxicitymasterycourse@gmail.com. All of our courses you take with successful completion of the course, including passage of the course exams, you get a certificate of completion, and then CMEs are also available where applicable. The next course for toxicity starts live this Monday, July 29th. So there's an early bird discount available, still in effect. If you're interested in this topic, this course is very, very comprehensive. As I mentioned before, if you want to get the ebook and more information about the Toxicity Mastery course, you can text the word toxicity. You pull out your cell phone, bring up your messages where you text the word toxicity to 66866. And then we also have a new version of our Functional Medicine Mastery course coming out in September at the end of the summer later this year. The Functional Medicine Mastery course is a 12-module course. It's a very extensive course on the implementation of functional medicine in the practice. It is considered to be a beginner's course in functional medicine, but it's much more comprehensive than any other functional medicine course that is available. Excuse me. you can go to functional medicine mastery course.com for more information about this particular course. And then I'm always available for private consultations through my private practice. The best place to reach us is through the email here at stmedicine. Feel free to reach out to us. Okay, so I hope this information was helpful to you. If you posted any questions today, what'll happen is Great Plains will send those questions to me via email, and I'll reply to those when I get those. So again, this is Dr. Kurt Wohler for the Great Plains Laboratory Complimentary Webinar Service. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and we will see you next month. Take care.